Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. Can everybody hear me okay? I hope. My name is Nora Messier, and I am the Manager of Education and Public Programs here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum, and it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you all to another episode of Hidden Collections. If you are here for the first time, I say welcome, and if you are here for the nth time, I say welcome back, and thank you for joining us. Our real host today is Bo Van Riper, our research librarian extraordinaire, who is going to take us through some of the objects that you wouldn't ordinarily get to see. And so he has delved deep into the archives to bring us an interesting selection of images about which he will share interesting, exciting, and otherwise hidden facts. And without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Bo. If you have questions during the presentation, please just type them into the chat box and we will attend to them toward the end of the session. Thank you again for being here.
Thanks, Nora, and welcome back, everybody, to Hidden Collections. If I could have the first slide, please. Just recently, the museum opened a new temporary exhibit called Picturing Martha's Vineyard, which features the photographs of Charles Schute and his son Richard on the one hand, and Edward Lee Luce on the other hand. And what I wanted to do for the first part of Hidden Collections today was to pivot off that exhibit and talk a little bit about the Schutes and Ed Lee Luce and their respective worlds. The Schutes got into the photography business somewhat earlier, just after the Civil War. And Ed Lee Luce, who was born in North Tisbury in 1879 and lived well into the 20th century, got into photography as the 19th century was ending. As the exhibit shows, their pictures have striking similarities, but also are vastly different in other ways. And collectively, they provide a fascinating picture of the vineyard in the late 19th and the very early 20th century. But this thing that you're seeing on the screen is not obviously a photograph. It's a small pocket-sized diary called a line a day diary, one line for each day of the year, beginning on New Year's Day and extending through New Year's Eve, meant for the diary keeper to sum up each day in one or at most two lines of text. This one was kept by Mary Abba Marchand, a mid-20-something daughter of a prosperous Edgartown family, for the year 1862. And if you're interested in exploring Mary's diary in more depth, there's an excellent article about it in the August 2018 Quarterly, which is available on the website. Mary Marchand's diary provides an insight not only into the life of an unmarried 20-something woman in a well-to-do white Edgartown family in the early years of the Civil War, but it also provides a striking insight because it offers a little tiny snapshot of every day into Edgartown life in the early part of the Civil War. For example, at the top of the right page here, Friday, August 29th, 1862, it says, went down to see the volunteers off. That is to say, went down to what was then Fisher's Wharf, what we'd now call Memorial Wharf, where the young men from Edgartown had volunteered to join the Union Army and go off and fight in the Civil War, were boarding a steamer that would take them south to the recruiting camp and thus off into the war. One of those young men was Charles McCreading Vincent, who would write extensive diaries of his own of the war that were later transcribed and published by Marion Halpern of the then Martha's Vineyard Historical Society in a book titled, in a book whose title used Vincent's familiar name that his family called him, Charlie Mack. Another one of those young volunteers was Richard Schute, who enlisted as a musician and went off to the war in the summer of 1862, only to return later on invalided out of the Army with an illness or injury that went unrecorded by history. Next slide, please. As you can see, Schute continued his interest in music right throughout his life. This is him playing in the Edgartown Cornet Band in August 1902, 40 years after he was a young recruit into the Union Army. That's him in the very top row left, holding his cornet up to his lips. Schute was defined by many things, by his musicianship, by his service in the Civil War era Union Army, but also by his involvement in photography. Next slide. Even more than his father, who was by the 1890s and early 1900s essentially out of the business, Richard Schute chronicled the lives of the well-to-do summer people of Oak Bluffs and Edgartown. We don't know who these three small boys standing on a small pier somewhere on Edgartown Harbor were, but the chances are excellent that they were summer people. They were part of the growing numbers that were in the 1890s coming to Edgartown purely for relaxation, leaving behind the hustle and bustle of the existence they had in Boston or Providence or New York or somewhere else on the mainland, coming to Edgartown to enjoy the swimming and the sailing and the golf and the cooling breezes off the sea and relax in a quiet, idyllic set of surroundings that were unlike anything that they would have experienced back home. Next slide, please. Schute made a point of photographing the big, elaborate summer houses along North and South Water Streets and North and South Summer Streets at a time, the 1890s and the early 1910s, when those houses were making the transition from being the year-round houses of well-to-do vineyarders to being the second summer houses of well-to-do summer people who came for 2 months or 10 weeks every summer. This is the Young House on South Water Street, 55 South Water to be exact. It got its start back in the 1660s as the house of John Coffin, Edgartown blacksmith, but it had grown enormously and elaborately by the time, Schute took its picture around the turn of the century. The younger woman seated somewhat in the background is Ellen Fellows Young. The man in the corner is her husband. The older woman in the foreground is her mother. And what's relevant here is not just that this is Schute photographing a well-to-do family in the course of photographing their big, elaborate summer house. He took a whole series of pictures of the Young House around 1900, and they represent our most complete documentation of any Edgartown summer house of that era. What's interesting about this photograph is not just that he took the pictures, but he clearly took the pictures as part of a larger project to photograph the houses and the stores of Edgartown in that era, and almost certainly did so with a view towards selling prints of those pictures to the shopkeepers and to the homeowners. Hello, sir, wouldn't you like to have a beautiful photograph of your business as it exists at this moment in history? Hello, madam, wouldn't you love to have a photograph of your house as it exists in this moment in history? For Schute, it was a way to make a living practicing his art. For us now, looking back, it's an incomparable historical document. Next slide, please. Schute also photographed large public spaces like this one, the Harborview Hotel. This would have been probably around 1893 when the Harborview was only 2 years old. The large addition that we think of stretching to the right side of the facade here hadn't been added yet. It wouldn't be until the old Matakeesit Lodge on the shores of Katama Bay was dismantled, and part of it was barged up to be added to the Harborview. The Harborview was the other arm of Edgartown's great transformation from whaling port into summer resort, along with the sale of the old houses on North and South Water and Summer Streets to summer people. The Harborview was Edgartown's second attempt. The Matakeesit Lodge had been the first, and its first successful attempt to replicate the resort hotel environment that Oak Bluffs had developed so efficiently. Oak Bluffs had a dozen big resort hotels by the 1890s. Edgartown had only the one, the Harborview, caught here in the moment of its youth, not yet grown to its current vast, sprawling size. Again, Schute was almost certainly doing this for commercial purposes. He almost certainly offered this photograph to the manager of the Harborview at an attractive price. But the fringe benefits accrue to us 120 or more years later. We have this beautifully composed, richly detailed photograph of the Harborview when it was new. Next slide. Schute worked out of Oak Bluffs as well as Edgartown. And you'll notice that in this photograph of a tent, they were still tents when the Schute team began their photographic work, that Schute is producing an extremely formal, posed kind of portrait. These men and women are clearly lined up deliberately in order to have their image captured for posterity. Every bit as much as the people who sat on divans and in upholstered chairs in Schute's studio were positioning themselves in the way they wanted to be recorded for years and seen by years and generations to come. Something to note just in passing is the trim along the canvas margins dangling from the roof of the tent. Think about that tent. Think about that decoration, and now imagine the gingerbread cottages that exist in the campground today. It's commonplace to observe that the shape of the cottages mimics the shapes of the tents they replaced. But so too, the gingerbread jigsawed wooden decorations along the eaves and the fences and whatnot mirror the decorations and the fripperies of the tents that they replaced as well. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, with his mania for all things simple and unadorned, would doubtless have been appalled. But it's apparent that the people who kept this tent and the people who kept the cottages that came after it, next slide, like Joseph Spinney, who merged the two cottages right and left with a central tower here, it's evident that the people who created those tents and these cottages and posed in front of them for Charles and Richard Schute loved the beauty and the decoration and the elaborateness of these tiny wooden and canvas worlds that they returned to in Oak Bluffs each summer. Next slide, please. Schute in in Oak Bluffs photographed extensively along the wharf and along the railroad tracks that led down the coast to Edgartown. He photographed steamers like the Island Home here, the sleek side-wheeled namesake of the current multi-deck diesel engine double-ender. He photographed the structures like the ticket office and pavilion there on the end of the wharf. He photographed the train and the train cars and the people waiting to board it. He photographed the train crews outside the depot in Edgartown and at the turnaround at Matakeesit Lodge. Much of what we know about the infrastructure of transportation along the coast of Oak Bluffs and Edgartown in the 19th century. We know because Richard and Charles Schute photographed it, and because they preserved their negatives, and because their family members in 1923, when the Dukes County Historical Society was founded, gave us a vast collection of them, many of which have been reproduced in the Picturing Martha's Vineyard exhibit. Next slide, please. This document has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with Richard Schute, but it was part of the Edgartown world in which he existed. This is the membership page from the 1901 records of the Young Men's Total Abstinence Association of Edgartown. Abstinence, perhaps significantly, had a different meaning then than it commonly does today. What the young men in question were abstaining from was not sexual relations, but alcohol. The Young Men's Total Abstinence Association of Edgartown was a temperance society, and its constitution, copied down in the first 12 pages of this record book, declared that its intention was to promote temperance and good citizenship, which two concepts that it regarded as completely inextricable from one another. It's worth noting that despite the name, it was not an association limited entirely to young men. Marcus W. Jernigan, the third signature on that list, was indeed a relatively young man. He was the younger brother of Laura Jernigan of Whaleship Diary fame, and Prescott Jernigan, who with his friend Charlie Fisher tried to defraud the people of Lubec, Maine by selling them shares in a bogus scheme to extract gold from seawater. Marcus Jernigan, after he was a member of the Young Men's Total Abstinence Association of Edgartown, went on to a distinguished career as a historian at the University of Chicago. James Chadwick, just above him, was the owner of the coal wharf where the seafood shanty now stands. Beriah T. Hillman was the judge of the Dukes County Probate Court and longtime political figure in Dukes County and the state of Massachusetts. He was, like Richard Schute, a Civil War veteran, and like Richard Schute, he appeared in his Grand Army of the Republic Union Veterans Organization uniform in 1920 when the World War I Memorial was dedicated at the corner of Main Street and Pisa's Point Way. Richard Schute, ever a musician, played the cornet and marched in the parade along with the young men just returned from France. And he and Hillman and the other surviving Civil War veterans of Edgartown, all 5 of them, thanked the young men from the American Expeditionary Force for their service in another greater, more far-flung war. Next slide, please. Ed Lee Luce came from a wholly different world where the Schutes, Richard Schute in particular, chronicled the world of the summer people, the hustling, bustling, tourist-driven economy of turn-of-the-century Oak Bluffs and Edgartown. Ed Lee Luce chronicled the farmlands and fields and country roads and barns and blacksmith shops of West Tisbury and North Tisbury and Chilmark. Here, he's photographing the stream that runs under State Road just past the North Road Fork on its way down towards the Great Ponds in the south. Next slide, please. This is the North Tisbury Baptist Church, which was a thriving congregation in Ed Lee Luce's day, but gradually fell on hard times and was deconsecrated between the 2 world wars, dismantled after damage in the 44 hurricane, and re-erected in part by Erford Burt along the shores of Lagoon Pond to become the basis of his boat building business that he started after he got out of the Navy. The Bass Creek Meeting House, as it was called after Bert turned it into a boat building shop, is still there. It's now the principal building of what used to be Prime Marina and is now Safe Harbor Marina, just across the street from the steps down from the lawn of the museum. Edley Luce, next slide, please. Documented buildings like the Howes House on State Road in West Tisbury, now the West Tisbury Council on Aging. Next slide, please. And he documented things like this sign somewhere along the roadside in West Tisbury. This photograph, like nearly all of Edley Luce's photographs, have an odd, slightly misty quality. Maybe a result of the lighting, maybe a result of the lens he used. If you've ever followed Dan Waters's Through an Old Lens photography series on Facebook, you see a more pronounced version of the look that Edley Luce's photographs have. Aesthetically speaking, they lack the absolute stark clarity of Richard Schute's work. And they give North Tisbury a strange, almost ethereal quality. Rather, it's almost as if when you look at Edley Luce's photographs, you're looking back not just in time, but through the mists of time. And yet, like Richard Schute's photographs, Edley Luce's are exceptional documents of a particular moment in history. They capture individuals and buildings and activities and events that have long since passed from the scene or changed beyond recognition. Just the details of this sign, the fact that it specifies not just the directions or the distances or the names of the towns, as a sign might today, but also details like Chilmark Post Office, 6 1/4 miles, Gayhead Lighthouse, 12 1/4 miles, and so forth. If you want an introduction to one of the, not games, but one of the things that historians routinely do with photographs, try dating this photograph just by looking at the details of the sign. There are directions to Cottage City, which didn't exist as an independent town before 1880. So the fact that it says Vineyard Haven rather than Holmes Hole, that name changed in 1871, is essentially not relevant. But we know it was after 1880, and yet before 1907, which was when Cottage City became Oak Bluffs. We can probably narrow it down further, though, because West Tisbury didn't become an independent town until 1892. Well, fair enough then. Menemsha Creek is a bit more complicated. Menemsha, the settlement, Menemsha, the fishing village, didn't start being called that until right around 1900, when the channel and the basin were dredged out by the Army Corps of Engineers. Before that, it was Creekville, or as the locals would have called it, Crickville. Whether the name Menemsha Creek was in use before that isn't, at least to me at the moment, entirely clear. If the name came into use when the village became Menemsha, then we can date this picture of the sign to sometime in the first decade of the 20th century, 1900 to 1907. Or if not, then from 7 to 10 years or so, either side of 1900, Edley Luce's heyday as a photographer. Next slide, please. North Tisbury is just a wide spot in the road today. The place where State Road Restaurant is and where R.G. Humphrey's Vineyard Food Shop of late memory used to be. The place where Alfred Eisenstadt once photographed a gigantic, maybe 300-year-old white oak whose branches drooped to the ground. But in Edley Luce's time, North Tisbury was a thriving village. It had a post office, now a yellow-painted retail building. It had a Baptist church, as we've seen. It had a post office. Yeah, it had a blacksmith shop. It had a fire station. It had a cluster of houses and a small cluster of businesses. And it was not just a wide spot in the road where North Road leaves State Road on its way to Menemsha. It was a distinct independent community within the larger town of Tisbury, and later, after 1892, within the larger town of West Tisbury. The Vineyard was like that in the years before automobiles and paved roads shrank the distances from point A to point B across the island. And so in the years around 1900, the years when Ed Lee Luce was a young man with a camera, it wouldn't at all have seemed unusual for there to exist such a thing as the North Tisbury Literary and Debating Club, where intellectually minded young people like Mrs. F.H. Reed and Miss Julia A. Cottle and their number 19 at the bottom of the list, Edward L. Luce, would come together periodically and discuss books and music and other such things. The North Tisbury Literary and Debating Society seems now like the punchline in a joke, like the University of Southern North Dakota at Hoople or something like that. An improbably ambitious enterprise for what sounds like a tiny rural community. But in the years around 1900, before the advent of the automobile, before the advent of extensive paved roads on the Vineyard, the idea that a prosperous village like North Tisbury would be its own self-contained social universe, with not just a post office and a church and a blacksmith shop and a general store, but also social organizations like the North Tisbury L&D, was considered absolutely normal. If the journey to Edgartown or Vineyard Haven or Oak Bluffs was too long to consider on anything like a regular basis, then, well, those who wanted an intellectual life in the wilds of North Tisbury created one for themselves and met every few weeks to discuss the higher and more refined things in life. What Ed Lee Luce said in those meetings is lost to history, but the fact that he was present tells us something about the kind of guy he apparently was. Next slide, please. For those of you who are interested in historical mysteries, here's one, and it comes from North Tisbury. The characters in the first line are not some kind of alien eye chart. They're characters that were copied from a stone, a boulder, found somewhere in the North Tisbury woods in 1920 by the hired man of a summer person named Godfrey Priester, who owned a house, the old Athern place, just off the North Road by what's now called Priester's Pond. John, the hired man's name is lost to history, was wandering across his employer's property one day in 1922. Pardon me, I said 20, but that was the year Priester bought the house. Wandering across his employer's property in 1922 when he stumbled across a boulder, he said, with these characters inscribed on it. He took a piece of brown wrapping paper from his pocket and copied the symbols down to bring back to show to Mr. Priester in case the boss thought there was something interesting about them. Priester did, in fact, think there was something interesting about them. They reminded him vaguely, possibly, of Norse runes. And there'd been rumors for nearly 40 years by then that the ancient Norse, on their way to explore what they called Vinland, had put ashore on the Vineyard, perhaps at No Man's Land, perhaps in Gay Head, perhaps in Chilmark, perhaps, Priester wondered, in North Tisbury. But the press of other business and disorganization gets the best of us all occasionally, and Priester put the piece of brown wrapping paper in a pile on his desk, and other things were set on top of it, and he forgot about it until such time as 25 years later, after World War II, something jogged his memory. He found the piece of paper and he shared it with Helmar Holland, a noted scholar of the Vikings in North America and a firm defender of the idea that the Vikings, the Norse, had reached Martha's Vineyard. Holland looked at it and produced the interpretation below, trying to convert the hired man's jottings of what he thought he saw with what Holland believed the runes on the stone actually were. Holland got a paper out of this in 1944. We have a copy in the Norse on Martha's Vineyard collection, RU 219. And Priester went on to show the piece of paper to another person who visited him 2 years later, who was similarly excited about the prospect that this represented evidence of a Norse presence, not just on the island, but in the very center of the island in North Tisbury. Whatever happened to the stone, we don't know. Nobody ever found it again. Nobody but John, who was long since gone and dead by the time Priester showed the paper to Holland in 1944, ever saw it that we know of. What happened to the paper? We don't know that either. It too was lost somewhere along the line. All we have is Holland's article commenting on his interpretation of somebody's sketch of a stone that none of them but the guy making the original sketch had actually seen. Is this evidence of Norse presence in North Tisbury? Well, as Carl Sagan once said, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and most scholars today would say that this is not the evidence that a claim of a Norse presence in North Tisbury demands. But for those of you who love mysteries, there's one for sure. And for those of you who are looking for an excuse to wander around in the North Tisbury woods, not, of course, that I would ever suggest that you trespass on private property, well, there's something to keep an eye out for. As we shift to the next slide, I want to move on past picturing Martha's Vineyard and Richard Schute and Ed Lee Luce to the Wampanoag history of the vineyard, because November is Native American Heritage Month. When we think about the history of the Wampanoag on Martha's Vineyard, we tend to think of it as being written in documents like this one, a deed between the sachem Josias of Nobnocket and Isaac Chase, one of the first European colonizers to reach the northern part of the island. Chase was a Quaker, and he'd been thrown out of Edgartown by the Mayhews and invited to settle elsewhere. Being an enterprising sort, Chase did settle elsewhere. He settled on the shores of Vineyard Haven Harbor, and by the time he died in the early 1700s, he owned everything from Vineyard Haven Harbor to the lagoon, Vineyard Haven Harbor to the eastern shore of Lake Tashmoo, and everything from the tip of the lagoon to the tip of West Shop. This document, which reflects the transfer of land from Josias, the Nobnocket sachem who had authority over it, to Chase, is written in English using the form that was typical for late 17th century documents in the North American colonies. It's line after line after line of dense, complicated, descriptive language and legal terms of art that would, to a relatively wealthy, educated man like Chase, have been readily legible. To a Wampanoag individual like Josias, reading a document like this written in technical language, in technical terms from a language not his own, reflecting an understanding of the relationship between humans and the land, that is to say, the individual ownership of particular described bounded pieces of property that was entirely alien to himself and to his own culture. It must have seemed a wildly alien thing. And yet, in the eyes of Chase and the other European colonizers, this document describing the land being transferred, the terms under which it was transferred, the price at which it was transferred, represented evidence that the transfer of the land from Josias to Isaac Chase was entirely and completely legal and appropriately done and above board. It's signed by the two parties at the lower right. Chase affixed his seal to it, that blob of red. Josias signed with his mark, since he wasn't literate in English, but his signature was witnessed by the two men whose names appear at the lower left of the block of text. And the entire thing was, that's the line in the signature at the bottom, witnessed and recorded by the local magistrate, Payne Mayhew, and filed in the Registry of Deeds, so that there would be henceforth and forever a record of the land transfer. If you've ever tried to grasp how the traditional histories of the Vineyard, Banks and Norton and the rest of them from the late 19th and early 20th century continually repeat that the Mayhews and the other English colonizers dealt fairly and squarely and honorably and legally with the Wampanoag, and you're wondering how to square that with the Wampanoag perception that they were, over the course of less than a century, dispossessed of virtually all their ancestral lands. This document represents part of the key. To the English, for whom this was their native language, for whom this was the system of land ownership they took for granted, for whom documents like these were part and parcel of their everyday lives as landowners, this was all perfectly straightforward and above board, and it had the seals and the signatures to prove it. To the Wampanoag, for whom this was an alien document representing the ways and beliefs of an alien culture, something that likely they could no more effectively fully comprehend than you or I could comprehend a similar document written in the legal lingo of a foreign language we don't speak. You begin to comprehend why two different groups could look back at this document and the process of which it was a part. The Dispossession of the Wampanoags is written in hundreds and hundreds of documents like these, all of them, in the eyes of the people who drew them up, legal and proper and perfectly executed. We think about the history of the Wampanoag on Martha's Vineyard as being written in long legal documents like these, but not always. Next slide, please. Sometimes it's written in tiny, almost incidental scraps of paper like this one. Notice to notify the inhabitants qualified to vote in town affairs to meet at the schoolhouse on the 4th day of November next between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. to vote for government officers. Signed, Charles H. Mingo. Dated Gay Head, October the 25th, 1879. Those of you who remember in great detail the history of Up Island may recall that Gay Head in 1870 went from being an autonomous Indian reservation in the terms of the time to being an incorporated town of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. A complex story that was the outgrowth of the Commonwealth's desire to integrate the Native American population of Massachusetts into quote unquote modern society, to encourage, or if necessary, force them to give up their traditional ways of life and adopt Western ways instead. When Gay had incorporated the men, not yet women, because the 19th Amendment was still 50 years out, of Gay Head gained the right to vote in town affairs and by the end of the decade in state elections as well. They were therefore eligible to vote in November of 1879 for the representative that the Vineyard sent to the state legislature. On the 4th of November, 1879, the election was held and Beriah T. Hillman of Edgartown lost to Stephen Flanders of Chilmark. Flanders's victory came not entirely, but in significant measure because the voting age men of Gay Head broke almost exclusively for Flanders. With Flanders occupying the Vineyard seat in the state legislature, it was Flanders to whom in January of 1880 the question was put, what shall the legislature do about this petition from the people of Oak Bluffs to be declared a separate town, to be granted independence from Edgartown? Hillman and the Edgartonians had always opposed such resolutions. Flanders had campaigned squarely in favor of independence for Oak Bluffs. And in January of 1880, he said, grant Oak Bluffs its independence. The legislature so voted, and the town of Cottage City came into existence. As improbable as it might seem, this slip of paper was the opening shot in the final battle of a political revolution on the Vineyard. A shot fired, as it turned out, by the newly enfranchised Wampanoag voters of Gay Head. Next slide. We think of historical documents as looking like the two I just showed you, as being beautifully handwritten. I mean, even that slip of paper saying, here are the dates and times of the election in Gay Head is, by modern standards, beautifully written. We tend to discount as just the flotsam of a gigantic bureaucratic society. Later, more recent historical documents that were typed on typewriters or printed from computers. And yet, look closely at this one. The letterhead is United States Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs. The date stamped on it is February 17th, 1987. And I'll spare you reading the details, but this is the cover letter going with the final determination in favor of federal acknowledgement of the Wampanoag Tribal Council of Gay Head. This is the moment when, after a decades-long battle, the Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head, Aquinnah, became federally recognized with all the benefits and privileges that go with that. This is the document, plain courier text on white paper, photocopied and stamped with a changeable rubber date stamp that probably cost $2.50 at some office supply dealer. This too is evidence of a political revolution and a reminder that the significance of historical documents lies not just in how beautiful they are, not just in how exotic or how alien they look, but in the contents of them, which, dull and boring as they may look at first glance, can itself be revolutionary. Next slide. Not all historical evidence, of course, is textual. Images, photographs, like the ones taken by the Charles and Richard Schute, Ned Lee Luce, are, as I've alluded to earlier, also historical documents. This one hardly counts as a hidden collection. This studio tintype of Francis Peters there on the left and Alonzo Belaine, two young whalemen between, we suspect, their second and third voyages, is on display in the voyaging cabinet in the One Island Many Stories Gallery. If you've been to the museum, you've probably seen it. If you've read Nancy Shoemaker's book on Native American whalemen, you've probably seen it. But especially when it comes to images, images as historical evidence don't exist entirely in a vacuum. For example, Alonzo Belaine there on the right, who, along with Peters, died on his third whaling voyage, one of them of tuberculosis, the other one lost at sea along with his whaleboat and crew. Alonzo Belain on the right there takes on a new significance when you realize that although he died before he was 30, next slide, please, his brother Joseph G. Belain went on and lived to a ripe old age, dying in the 1920s in New Bedford after a whaling career that ran to 26 voyages, many of which he served as first mate, 2 of which he served as acting captain. That image of Belain, by the way, was painted by Heather Neal based on a tintype not unlike the one of Peters and Alonzo Belain I just showed you. It appears on the back of Skip Finley's book, Whaling Captains of Color, and the original hangs on the wall of the library here at the museum. Next slide. This, too, isn't an unfamiliar hidden bit of the collections. If you've seen the shipwrecks exhibit, you've seen this picture on the wall. That's the Massachusetts Humane Society lifeboat that was stationed on the beach at Gay Head in the late 19th century before there was a federal life-saving service. And those 6 men are the second of the 2 crews that used that lifeboat to rescue survivors from the wreck of the city of Columbus when she went ashore on Devil's Bridge off Gay Head in January of 1884. That's James Mosher of Chilmark, the kinsman of Lucinda Mosher Vincent, the Lucy Vincent of Lucy Vincent Beach, standing holding the steering oar. Mosher was white, but the other 5 men in that boat and all 6 men in the first crew were Wampanoag volunteers, fishermen, whalemen, boatmen of all sorts who were used to handling small boats in rough weather and who understood the hidden hazards of Vineyard Sound between the Elizabeths and Gay Head. Next slide, please. Here's the first boat crew. The gentleman standing in the back with the steering oar is Joseph Peters. Francis Peters, the guy on the left of the tintype of the 2 young whalemen, was his brother. If you read down the names of the other boat crew members, John Vanderhoop, James and Tom Cooper, Samuel Anthony, Samuel Haskins, you'll recognize them as old Gay Head Wampanoag families. And you'll note in passing why the Wampanoag history of the island is sometimes all but invisible to outsiders. Unless you already know the history of the Vineyard, it's not at all self-evident that Vanderhoop and Cooper and Haskins and Peters are, in the context of Aquinnah, Wampanoag names. Next slide, please. Those 2 shots by John Chamberlain of the boat crews posing with the boat after the disaster were posed every bit as much as the studio tintypes of Joe Belain or Francis Peters and Alonzo Belain. Here's a candid shot of all the boat crews together, along with the crew members of a third boat crew that tried to reach the wreck in another boat only to be thrown back onto the shore and wrecked on the boulders. Nobody's posing here. At the very most, somebody, the camera operator presumably said, "Hey guys, look this way." And so it captures them not trying to pose for posterity, but just there. Now that in itself is an interesting shot, but next slide, please. It becomes more interesting when you find a copy in the archives where somebody who clearly was there or at least knew the people in the picture went through and labeled nearly all of them. That's how we find out that the gentleman on the far left with the round-topped hat and the oar in his hands was Horatio Pease, then the keeper of the Gay Head Light, and that the fellow with the bucket and the top hat and the frock coat who looks like he's totally out of place was a minister of some sort. From what church, we don't know. You'll notice at the far right of the picture, James Mosher with his beard and Joseph Peters leaning against the end of the boat. Next slide, please. For the sake of clarity, I took a copy of this photograph and turned the handwritten stuff into written out stuff. And you can pick out some of the same names that you saw on the labeled version of the first boat crew. For example, Samuel Anthony there in the middle, just to the left of the guy with the anchor, or Leonard Vanderhoop, a couple to the left of him, with the billed flat top cap. Next slide, please. The Massachusetts Humane Society was a private charitable organization that funded boats and boathouses that were manned by volunteer crews. It was superseded at the end of in the 1890s by the U.S. Life-Saving Service, which was in turn absorbed into merged with the Revenue Cutter Service in the 20th century to form the U.S. Coast Guard. This is the U.S. Life-Saving Service boathouse at Gay Head that supplanted the Humane Society boathouse. And this is the U.S. Life-Saving Service crew posing with their boat. The young man on the far side of the boat, on the right-hand end of the line, is a very young Everett Poole. Opposite him, the near side of the boat, on the right end of the group of three, that's Samuel Anthony, one of the heroes of the city of Columbus. Next slide. This is a program from a day in July 1918 when dignitaries from across the Commonwealth, including Governor Samuel Mccall and Lieutenant Governor, soon to be President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, came to the island. They were coming to Gay Head, as it was known then, to dedicate what became known as the Mccall Shield of Honor, a plaque affixed to a boulder outside the town hall that honored Gay Head for sending a greater percentage of its male population to fight in World War I than any other town in the Commonwealth. Gay Head being the town it was in 1918, virtually all of the Gay Head men who went into the armed services during World War I were of Wampanoag descent. And so Mccall, the honor that Mccall paid to Gay Head and the men who fought in World War I was not just perceived as an honor to the island, not just perceived as an honor to the town, but was perceived in Gay Head as an honor to the men of the Wampanoag tribe. Next slide, please. If you open the program, it's astounding to realize that nearly all of it is ads. The actual information is just a narrow band across the midsection of each page. On the left page here, it says that at 12:40 p.m., the parade of the band and the governor's party will take place, and the national and state flags will be raised, and the golden keys to Martha's Vineyard will be presented to Governor Mccall by 6 young daughters of our island. Now, why would I pick that particular bit out of all the text in this pamphlet to call your attention to? Here's why. Next slide, please. Because that phrase, 6 young daughters of the island, why 6? Well, there are 6 towns on Martha's Vineyard by 1918. Suddenly, when I read it, made this picture make sense for the first time. Next slide, please. We knew that this had to be some kind of ceremonial occasion. 6 women, each wearing a sash bearing one of the names of one of the island towns. 2 little kids in front of them holding American flags, sailors in uniform arrayed behind them. There seems to be some kind of a brass band involved. But when was this taken? What the heck were these women dressed up like this for? What was the occasion? That one tiny line of text in the brochure gives us the answer. These are almost certainly the 6 daughters of Martha's Vineyard who were presenting the golden keys to the island to Governor Mccall when he came to dedicate the plaque in Gay Head, which means that this photograph was taken on July 26, 1918. Part of the historian's job is figuring out how to connect up seemingly disparate pieces of evidence to slowly create a mosaic-like picture of the past. Next slide, please. This guy, Leonard Vanderhoof, one of those men from Gay Head who went to war and fought as part of the American Expeditionary Force in France. He was wounded, but he came home safely, went on to become a tribal elder, deacon of the Gay Head Baptist Church, a selectman, an esteemed figure in the community. Next slide, please. He was also, you'll recall, one of those guys in the picture of the City of Columbus rescuers. That's him in the billed cap with the flat top next to Jim Cooper and Tom Manning. Next slide. And that's him just ahead of James Mosher, pulling the stroke oar in the Massachusetts Humane Society boat, just as he did on that terrible night in January of 1884, helping to bring back the 20-odd people who lived through the disaster of the City of Columbus. The history of the Wampanoag on the Vineyard is written not just in documents like that deed to Isaac Chase, not just in tiny scraps of paper like the notice of the election, not just in formal photographs like this one, or like the posed photographs of Francis Peters and Alonzo Belaine or Captain Joseph Belaine. It's also written in fragments and scraps and stray lines scattered through documents that are themselves scattered through the collections of this museum and other museums, and through trunks and books and boxes in attics all across the island. Part of our ongoing struggle as a museum is to track down those scattered bits and slowly, painstakingly connect them to, for example, cross-check the faces in that labeled group shot and translate them onto labels for the people in the boat crews here. Someday we'll figure out who that slender-looking guy with the tiny little mustache is, second from the left in this photograph. He's unlabeled in the group shot. Part of our job as a museum is to figure out what we have in our archives that we don't yet know we have, that adds another piece to the story of the Wampanoag on the Vineyard. It's a long, difficult process, but few things we do here are as important. That's Hidden Collections for November 2021, Native American History Month. Join us first Wednesday in December for another round of Hidden Collections and a glance at how the Vineyard in the last century or so learned to be modern. And to a question that somebody posed in the question and answer, why in recent years am I sometimes hearing the tribe's name pronounced Wampanoag? Like Bo, I grew up on the island pronouncing it Wampanoag and never heard it pronounced with the A, final A silent. The answer, when I first came to work at the museum, I put that question to a member of the tribe, and what she told me was that most Vineyard Wampanoag, in her experience, pronounce the A, but most Mashpee Wampanoag don't pronounce the A. So that either version is correct, but the Wampanoag, the pronunciation of it as Wampanoag is more traditional, at least in Aquina on the Vineyard. But you hear both because people hear both. When the Mashpee Wampanoag are referenced in the news, for example, it's always with the A silent. And so because people grow up hearing both, both are used interchangeably. It may well be that there's more to it than that, and I don't, for example, know whether the Chappaquiddick members of the tribe prefer one or the other or traditionally use one or the other, but that's what I can tell you. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.